welcome to Precious Pursuit Radio. I'm your host, Jeremy DePanger, and I'm so glad you could join me today. Every episode of this show has a single goal: to discover objective truth with boldness and grace. Before we get started, I want to issue my first of two reminders for this episode that if you find this content interesting, edifying, or otherwise entertaining, please like, share, subscribe, leave a review, or all of the above. Tonight's episode is a live recording, so we are live on YouTube, and whenever we go live, you can always join us here on YouTube. If you're unable to join live and want to watch or listen after the fact, you can check out new and old episodes on my YouTube channel, Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Play. Just search for Precious Pursuit Radio, and you'll find the latest episode right there at the top. So after tonight's episode has been uploaded, you'll see episode 2 right there at the top on each of those platforms. So a quick comment about live chat. Live chat is turned on YouTube, which means that anybody that wants to participate in the discussion we're having tonight, feel free to do so. I will be reading the comments at the end of the episode and responding to any thoughts or questions that people have regarding the content in tonight's episode. I won't be responding to anything during the episode because I want to have a steady flow of the content as we discuss. It's just easier for me to get through what I want to say and then respond to what people have to say at the end. So we'll save a few minutes at the end if there are any comments from people. So feel free to post whenever you have a thought, and then once we get to the end, we'll go over your thoughts and questions. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into tonight's topic, which is common fallacies on social media. So tonight's topic is inspired by our episode last week, which was the breakdown of discourse. And we did talk a lot about social media in last week's episode, but I wanted to kind of look at a subset of that and talk about various types of logical fallacies that I see on social media platforms, mainly Twitter and Facebook. There are others, of course, but those are the two that I primarily use. Now, I will say that logical fallacies can occur anytime that a human being is speaking. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is not exclusive to a social media platform or social media in general. It can happen even if you're just having a conversation with someone in real life. But I want to talk about social media in particular because I find that the sheer quantity of logical fallacies that I see on social media, it seems to be a lot more rampant, a lot greater than when you're just having a conversation with someone in real life. I think people in general, in face-to-face communication, people tend to be less combative, less argumentative, and tend to be a little bit more diplomatic in person than they are online. And we talked about that last week. One of the main reasons for that is because there's no accountability for what you say online. You can literally create an anonymous account or an account with a picture that looks like something else or is just a picture of, Mount Rushmore or something, and say whatever you want to someone, and there's no accountability for it. There's no particular reason for you not to say what you want to say. Like, there's nothing blocking you from doing that. Whereas in person, you have your feeling of with the person. You may feel awkward or not awkward. You may want to relate to a particular person. You're trying to read the person's body language. There's all kinds of things that are in play when you're talking with someone in person. And so just all this to say that I think that the fallacies occur because not necessarily because people aren't thinking them in their head, but because people just tend to be less combative in person. So we see these sorts of fallacies in a greater quantity on social media. So the problem statement for tonight's episode is that logical fallacies run rampant on social media. So we're going to go through 10 fallacies tonight. We're not, obviously, since this is just a 30-minute episode, we're not going to spend more than just a couple minutes on each fallacy type. So the flow is going to be we're going to list off the fallacy. We're going to read a definition of it or talk about the definition of it. And then I'll give an example. And if it's confusing, we can talk about it at the end. I'll try to, there are some that are a little bit more straightforward than others. So I think the examples I tried to make common and generic enough that people will be able to pick up immediately on what they are. That's my hope anyway. If I did not succeed in doing that, please let me know and we can dive a little bit deeper into it later on and at the end of the episode when I answer your guys' questions. So fallacy number 1 is the non sequitur. And by the way, the 10 fallacies that I have for tonight's episode, these are not listed in terms of anything. So I didn't list them in terms of the most common that I see or anything like that. This was the ordering is random. I will make a comment as we go through each one about how often I see each of these fallacies, because I think that's relevant, at least in terms of trying to spot them. So actually, real quick, before we talk about the first fallacy, I want to just quickly say that the reason we're doing this, the reason we're talking about fallacies is to number 1, to be able to identify them when we see them. In order to avoid using them ourselves and therefore become a more effective communicator, but also in order to be able to push back against things that are untrue or unhelpful. Now, I know that bad habits can be hard to break. You may, as we're reading through each of these fallacies, you may realize, say when we get to number 6 or something, you may realize, oh, I do that all the time. I better pay attention to that. Or I've never even heard of that. Oh yeah, that's what that is. Because you may see it and recognize that happening all the time on Facebook, but you didn't know what to call it. Now you have a name for it. You can identify it and learn how to blot that out of your own communication. So that's the objective that we're going to try to tackle tonight. And ultimately, by becoming more effective communicators, by removing logical fallacies from our communication, and by pushing back against logical fallacies that come from other people, we inherently will be having conversations that drive closer to the truth and seek objective truth, objective reality, which, as I've said before, is the whole purpose of this show, is how do we have discussions? How do we seek truth with boldness and grace? That's what we're trying to do here. So by eliminating logical fallacies, we take one step closer to that goal. Okay. So fallacy number 1, the non sequitur. So a non sequitur is simply when someone states a conclusion that doesn't follow from what they had just been saying. So, for example, Bob makes great burgers, so therefore he should run for president. Obviously, whether or not Bob is qualified to run for president, or whether he wants to or should run for president, has nothing to do with whether he makes great burgers or the fact that he makes great burgers. Those have nothing to do with each other. I see this a lot, actually. Not as often as some of the other fallacies that we're going to get into, but I do see this relatively frequently where people just make connections between things that are totally unrelated. And it ends up just causing confusion or making people say harsh things to them online. So this is something I think is pretty easy for us to avoid if we think about what we're saying. And I hope that that's actually true of all 10 of these fallacies, that if you just think for a moment before you say what you want to say, that you'll be able to blot out some of these. So that's number 1. Number 2 is the whataboutism. Now, if you're on Twitter, you may hear people use that term a lot. And I actually, for a little while, I actually didn't know what it meant. And so I was listening to people talk about it, and then I looked it up. And it's actually a very common thing that happens in just about every Twitter thread that I read that has any kind of hot button issue. So political, religious, any current events, anything. This happens all the time. This might be the most common fallacy on Twitter. Maybe a little bit less so on Facebook, but this is a very common fallacy on Twitter. What is a whataboutism? Well, a whataboutism is the technique or practice of responding to an accusation or a difficult question by making a counter accusation or raising a different issue. So someone throws an accusation at you or raises a tough question or makes a difficult point, and then you respond to it by just bringing up a different issue or by basically trying to sidestep what they said and focus the attention on something else. Try to get the limelight off of you or off of the point you're making onto something else. So I think all of us can probably testify to how often this happens in the political realm when someone makes a claim about President Biden or former President Trump, and the opposing side just immediately counteracts with, oh, well, your guy did this, right? So if you're a fan of Joe Biden and someone criticizes Joe Biden on Twitter, all you see is just people ripping on Trump, right? When the point that was made is a criticism, let's assume for the sake of conversation that's a valid criticism of something that Joe Biden did, people won't engage with the actual substance or merit of the claim. They'll just say, oh, well, Trump is bad because of XYZ. And that happens in reverse. People will say, make a criticism of Trump, and then defenders of Trump will deflect off of that to then say, well, Joe Biden is bad because of whatever. So we see that all the time in politics. And it gets to the point where, honestly, if you're reading a political thread on Twitter, it's so full of that there's no actual merit being discussed at all about the claim being made. And one thing I hear in people will try to defend using a whataboutism by saying, well, what your guy did was worse, so we should focus on that more than what our guy did. And I think that there are actually specific times when that is valid, but maybe only like 5% of the time. 95% of the time, when someone makes a valid, constructive, critical claim about a policy decision, for example, what should be discussed is the merits of that claim and the merits of the policy decision, so that we can arrive as a collective on whether that policy or that criticism is fair, correct, true, and then do something about it. If it's a bad policy on the merits, then we shouldn't enact it. If the criticism is invalid, then we should dismantle the criticism and proceed with the policy. So, but people don't often want to do that hard work. They just want to deflect the blame onto someone else so that they don't have to think critically about the things that they're a fan of. So that's fallacy number 2. Fallacy number 3 is the AdHominem, and this happens, actually, this is coupled with number 2. When whataboutisms are happening, oftentimes AdHominems are used or kind of tucked into those. So an AdHominem is just when you argue against the person rather than the point they're making. So you say, oh, that person is, like, someone makes an argument, and then the response is, oh, well, you're stupid, or you're dumb, or that you don't have the credibility to say that, or, I'm not going to listen to you because whatever. An example of that is someone says, I think the United States should reform its tax policy. And then someone responds to that person by saying, you're so rich, why should I listen to anything you have to say? So it can consist of direct attacks on the person, their personality traits, even what they look like, that have nothing to do with the argument that they made or the point that they made. Sometimes it can also consist of trying to discredit the person, but that's actually somewhat of a separate type of fallacy that we're going to get into in a minute. the pure ad hominem is just, I'm going to attack you, oftentimes because I don't have anything constructively critical to say about your argument or your position. So number four is poisoning the well. Now, this is related to the ad hominem. And the definition of poisoning the well is when adverse information about a target or person is preemptively presented to an audience with the intention of discrediting or ridiculing something that the target person is about to say. So we see this, the most common example that I can think of is political campaign ads, negative advertising. When a candidate A launches an ad campaign against candidate B, and that ad campaign consists of all sorts of claims and attempts to discredit the person because they know that that person is going to try to argue for something, oftentimes that undercuts the person making the negative ad, right? So person A creates the ad. It's a bunch of negative things about person B, and they do it because they know that person B has an argument against them, or because they just need to discredit person B in some way, shape, or form in order to win an election, for example. I think pretty much every negative campaign ad consists of this. You'll also see it in debates too. With debates, I put air quotes debates because, let's be honest, the presidential debates that we have, Senate debates, gubernatorial debates, are just circuses that involve, anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes of someone just giving buzz phrases about something and having very little substance, and full of ad hominem attacks, full about whataboutisms, full of poisoning the well. You start your statement, instead of making a constructive argument with your time, oftentimes politicians will just say a bunch of terrible things about their opponent in the hopes that you will then not listen to their substance because you don't like them anymore. So that's poisoning the well. Number 5 is the straw man. Now, the straw man, this is a common one, and this can be tricky sometimes because you actually have to pay attention to what the original person was trying to say. The definition of the straw man fallacy is when someone responds to a distorted version of your argument rather than your actual argument. So, for example, someone says, because of the thefts in our building, I think we should add more security cameras. And someone responds to that by saying, so you're saying you don't trust your neighbors? So you can see how that can be tricky a little bit, because the response may actually be true. It may be true that that person doesn't trust their neighbors, but that isn't the claim that they're making. The claim that they're making is they think there should be more security because there were thefts. It's a fact that there were thefts, and they think the solution to that is more security cameras. So instead of, or if you don't want security cameras, instead of arguing for why there shouldn't be security cameras, you just try to undercut the person by attacking an argument that they didn't make. And we see that all the time in politics, and we see it all the time in social media. So the key to this one, the key to cutting through straw men, is to go back. If you're ever confused in a thread or listening to someone talk, go back to the very beginning and listen to the declarative statement that they make. What does that consist of? In this example, fact, there were thefts in the building. Solution, add more security cameras. Just those two things, right? And if the conversation wades off into other things that aren't related to that, then you know that people have lost their center and need to come back to the actual claim being made. And if you can go one step above and beyond just identifying it, actually jump into the conversation and say, excuse me, that's not what the person said. Let's go back to what they actually said and focus on the claim that they made instead of all this other stuff that seems to me like it doesn't have anything to do with what we were talking about. And thus redirect towards facts, logic, evidence that hopefully eventually arrives at the truth or an effective solution to a problem. So fallacy number 6, that was straw man. Fallacy number 6 is reductionism. So this is when a complex concept or a complex argument is reduced to a subset of its components as if it represented the whole. So this is a pretty extreme example, but I'll give it anyway to make the point. The Constitution is merely a piece of paper. Okay, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say that, but it's a great example because it exemplifies that, yes, it's true to say that the Constitution is a piece of paper, well, papers, but it's not merely a piece of paper. So it's a partial truth, but it's not the whole truth. And it zeroes in on the partial truth and ignores all the other aspects or nuances of what's being said. So we see this all the time. And I think a lot of this is driven by emotion when people do this because they don't want to spend the time to understand the nuance of what someone is saying. So they zero in on a particular aspect of what the person said that they don't like, that upsets them for whatever reason. And then they reduce that person's argument down to just that thing and they attack that thing, even though that thing is either only partially true or not true without the broader context. So number 7, fallacy number 7 is appeal to authority. Now this one, it has a little bit of a nuance to it. So I want to make sure we spend a couple of minutes talking about how to navigate appeal to authority. So the definition of this fallacy is where the opinion of an authority on a topic is used as evidence to support an argument. So we have to be careful with what we're going to say here because I know that there are many people that will very quickly want to push back against this. So we have to be careful with how we define this. It is not valid to make an argument that only consists of an authority or expert's opinion on something. So as an example, the mayor said that the crime rate is down. It may be the case that the mayor or the expert in whatever topic is being discussed, an expert, may be in a position to be able to offer valuable evidence and substance to a discussion about, in this case, the crime rate. But their opinion alone is not an argument. You still need to look at the data that they looked at, the evidence that they looked at to get to their opinion. Right? So when this happens all the time. I feel like this has happened a lot in the last couple of years with COVID and with a lot in politics where we just trust something that someone says without actually doing any research on our own to verify that statement is true. And then we get upset or argue against other people that may question that authority or that expert when we think that because that expert thinks something that therefore equals that statement is true or that thing is true. And that's not valid, right? If you look at any logic textbook, any philosophical work, you know it's not valid. An argument that's just based on an opinion is not a valid argument. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take into account what experts or authorities say. That's not what I'm trying to say here. If let's say there's a study done that a certain type of energy pollutes the environment more than another type of energy, and an expert goes on CNN or something and talks about it for 5 minutes, and we listen to that person, a lot of times what we want to do is say, oh, that person's an expert on energy. He said that, energy type A causes pollution, so therefore we shouldn't use energy type A. Case closed, discussion over, go home. If you think anything else, you're wrong. That's not how we should do things. If we hear someone say that, then what that should do is that should be an indicator that there's data out there that we can go look at. There's evidence that we can actually go look at, that because that's helpful to know that there's a study there that we can go read and assess what is the truth value of these person's claims. Because remember, in the background of all of this, every expert or authority is, except for God, is by definition a human being. And human beings are flawed. We have ulterior motives. We have biases. We have emotion. We have all kinds of things that can distort the truth that we may be trying to convey, or sometimes non-truth that we may be trying to convey. And so anytime that we listen to someone, an authority or an expert on something, we should always double back and do our own research. That doesn't make us an expert now, just because we did some research, but it does help to say, okay, well, now I have some evidence that what this person is saying is actually true. And once you gather enough of that evidence and you hear enough of people say something, it seems to point to a logical conclusion based on the data, then it may be fair at that point or valid to say, yeah, I think that's a true conclusion. I can move on with my life now. But oftentimes we don't do the legwork to actually do the research to go far enough to really be able to get to the point where we can say, yeah, I've actually checked out what that person said and it makes sense and I can believe that. I'm justified in believing. Okay, so fallacy number 8 is the thought terminating cliche. And this one is, I don't know if a logic textbook would actually have this in it. This is more of a conversational thing. It's basically slamming the door on a conversation about something. So you say, a thought terminating cliche is when you end a debate with a cliche and not an argument. So if you say something, you make a point, and then you end your point with, well, it is what it is. Or, point A, point B, point C, but, I don't know. You essentially either discredit everything you just said, you discredit yourself, or you terminate the conversation. You put a cap on the conversation when it's not really over. You haven't actually argued or concluded anything. You've just ended it by saying a non-statement. It's like when people start their sentences by saying basically. Basically is a non-word. There's a category of words called non-words that people start their sentences with that are just as meaningful as starting a sentence with or A thought terminating cliche is precisely that, but at the end of an argument rather than at the beginning of a sentence. So just avoid those because they don't add any value to the conversation that you're having. Fallacy number 9 is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. For the 1% of you out there that know Latin, you may know what this means. You may know how to translate this directly. For those of you that don't, I will do it for you. So post hoc ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore because of it. Something happened, and therefore it must have been caused by the thing that happened before it. Example: every time the rooster crows, the sun comes up. So therefore, the rooster must be the cause of the sun coming up. Okay, well, we know that's not true. And just because the rooster crows before the sun comes up doesn't mean that the rooster causes the sun to come up. I don't see this one as often on social media. I do see it sometimes, but people fall into this when they don't think carefully about causation, because causation can actually be a very complex thing to analyze about a piece of evidence or a conclusion or an event that happens, right? So this one can be a bit tricky to put your finger on sometimes. But the best way to approach this is to just try to use as much common sense as possible. And if it sounds fishy, if it sounds like the two things a person that are saying, the cause and the effect, are disconnected, then question it. At least you can raise the question and say, hey, wait a minute. I don't necessarily think that the result, the sun coming up, is caused by the rooster. What makes you think that? And then the person can explain why they think that there's a causal relationship rather than just a temporal relationship between those two things. And that can lead to some interesting discussion and may lead to additional opportunities for you to point out possible errors in thinking, or maybe a better way to think about the event that happened or the causes that may have caused that event or not caused the event. So the 10th and final one, and this is kind of just, I threw in here for fun. This is also not going to be in a logic textbook, but I found this one online and I thought it was really funny. We'll end it with that tonight, is the Google effect. So this is endearingly defined as forgetting information that can easily be found with a Google search. So many times I've been in a social media conversation or been reading through a conversation and I just see people like circling, beating around the bush, kind of circling around information or making assumptions or talking about things. And if all they did was just research the thing real fast, they would really quickly see that, oh, this is a non-issue. Or, oh, I have the data I need to now make a conclusion. Instead of just like this guessing game or wondering about things, when you could just go do a Google search and answer it in like 10 seconds. Now, I will say real quick to be careful about Google searches. Don't just do a Google search and then go with the top hit and then now believe that you know the truth on something. Google searches will bring up a lot of information and they are quick, which is a benefit, but you still need to do the work of sifting through the content to verify the validity of the data that's being presented or the opinion that's being stated. You still have to do that, even though the information is available online. And that can be really hard with some things. It's gotten increasingly harder over the years as more and more news organizations have turned into basically just opinion sites. There's less just objective argumentation occurring and more opinion pieces out there. There's always motive when you're talking about media. So if you want to try to find objective sources of things, it's always good to have multiple sources, and B, sources that at least don't have a very clear ulterior motive for something. And it can oftentimes help to find someone that you would think would be opposed to that thing, believing that thing. So like, for example, if there's, this is not the best example, I'll admit, but just take it and let's run with it. If you're trying to find out whether whether a fact exists or not, like if someone says something is a fact, you're trying to figure out if it's really a fact, and you go online. If you find someone that you think would be predisposed to thinking that it's not a fact, but then they confess or admit that it is a fact, that can be powerful evidence that it is a fact. But I would always look for multiple sources to corroborate whatever it is you're trying to research. That'll give you more confidence. It usually will yield to a better result, a more truthful result in your research. So that's my advice. But again, the Google is vast. There's a lot of bad information on the internet, and we all know that. But sometimes we can cut certain conversations short by just looking it up and resolving it right then. So those are the 10 fallacies that we're going to go over tonight. That's it for the content for tonight's episode. What I would recommend is the remedy for these sorts of off the rails social media conversations, or if you happen to see these sorts of things in person-to-person conversations, first memorize these fallacies. Memorize what they are, what they mean. If you can have a generic example of it in your head, like I think the for post hoc ergo propter hoc, the rooster crows, the sun comes up example is just kind of an easy visual to remember. It's helpful for me anyway. Practice. So number one, memorize the fallacies. Number two, practice identifying them in conversations. Not always out loud, right? You don't want to be annoying and obnoxious to the people you're communicating with, but at least practice identifying them in your head, both from other people and from yourself if you happen to slip up and use one. And then lastly, do your best to eliminate them from your own communication. Focus on how you can improve the veracity of what you're saying and the productiveness and the effectiveness of the conversation. I can promise you they'll increase when you focus more on this. And as a result, your communication will become more truth-centered, productive, and persuasive too, when you're using real facts, real data, real arguments, making conclusions that follow from the premises, that you have well-defended premises. Those matter in communication. They matter in seeking truth, and they matter in edifying and uplifting those around us when we're trying to, especially when we're trying to solve problems that involve real people, real things, impact real lives around us. So that about wraps it up for our discussion on common fallacies on social media. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. Please go ahead and leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments below if you didn't already. I'm looking right now. I don't see any comments from the live chat right now. So if you have any comments after the fact, please do not hesitate to write them there. I will do my best to respond to them. A special thanks to you. Thanks to the folks who were able to join live tonight. If you missed the live discussion, you can always watch or listen after the fact here on my YouTube channel, Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Play. And go ahead and drop a like and tell a friend if you enjoyed the content tonight. Thanks again, and until next time, God bless.